to ask rhetorically, did the preceding Cold War ever really end? Everybody says the Cold War ended. There's some dispute about when historians should date it, 1989, 1990, or with the end of the Soviet Union in 1991. So the people who played a diplomatic role, like Jack Matlock, who was the American ambassador to the Soviet Union, argues that the Cold War ended through negotiations, peacefully, with no winners and no losers, or rather, as Jack would say, both sides were winners in ending the Cold War. Now there's been a revisionist interpretation of how all that ended, because after the Soviet Union, if you would ask probably a high school student who'd been reading some history or a college student, they would say the Cold War ended in 1991 when the Soviet Union ended. You understand the difference? In other words, we won it. But if you take a different view, that we didn't win it, but it was negotiated. Both sides negotiated an end. But what happened was, after the end of the Soviet Union, and this began with George Bush, the first George Bush, and it bitterly upset Gorbachev, who'd been a party to the negotiations that ended the Cold War. George Bush began to run against Clinton on the grounds that he had won the Cold War as a campaign slogan. He knew it not to be true, but for political...
Sure.
But it entered the bloodstream. And then you come into this, what I call triumphalism, American triumphalism. I mean, what could make you feel better to say that there had been a 40-year shadowy Cold War with the Soviet Union and we won?
It's understandable.
So then you mentioned earlier, however, that this triumphalism then leads to a certain kind of foreign policy thinking in Washington that leads to certain foreign policy. There's a direct line, surely, between the view that we won the Cold War and our decision to attack Iraq. Would you agree there's a connection there?
Between the end of the Cold War and the second Persian Gulf War,
well,
the first one.
If we can knock off the Soviet Union, who can't we knock off? And where does our mandate stop? Nowhere. We are now the sole surviving superpower.
I think it took some time for that to bake in.
You may be too young to remember, but in the 90s, people were running around in Washington saying we're the only superpower now.
Sure, no. I mean,
well, what license does that give you?
Yeah.
If you think like that.
Well, to be frank, personally,